The key question is, what was the significance of Operation Barbarossa? By attacking the Soviet Union, Hitler was fulfilling his aim for Lebensraum, or living space for the German people. Clearly, the natural resources of the USSR, including oil, were vast and would be ideal for the expansion of the German race. Hitler's motives for invading the Soviet Union, however, were mainly ideological. Hitler was impatient to get on with destroying a country that was not only full of people inferior in his eyes, such as the Slavs, but also full of communists. During the 1930s, Hitler repeatedly expressed his belief that communism was one of the greatest threats to German society and culture, despite acknowledging that a temporary alliance with the Soviet Union could work in Germany's interests. Hitler's military endgame, therefore, always had been the Soviet Union in its sights. Even in the early stages of the war, his attention was drawn to the east and to planning for the attack, and he was clearly frustrated by Britain's refusal to make peace, which thus delayed his plans for Russia. In the end, he decided to leave Britain undefeated, believing that it would not be in a strong enough position to open a second front and that the Soviet Union would easily be defeated. He was also anxious to launch an attack on the USSR to put a stop to Stalin's own territorial gains. Plans for the invasion, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, were drawn up at the end of 1940. The plan envisioned a three-pronged attack: in the north towards Leningrad, in the center towards Moscow, and in the south through the agriculturally and industrially rich Ukraine. The invasion started on June 22, 1941, and involved 121 divisions of the German army, backed up by massive air support in a blitzkrieg attack. Although the Soviets actually had greater numbers of men, tanks, and aircraft, the Germans were able to take advantage of the element of surprise. The Soviets had ignored both warnings of Churchill concerning the impending invasion and also their own intelligence. Stalin, presumably believing that Hitler would honor the Nazi-Soviet pact and continue to avoid a war on two fronts. The Soviets were also still re-equipping their army and air force following the humiliating war with Finland, and the army was recovering from the impact of Stalin's purges, which had wiped out the best of the Red Army's command. In contrast to the Soviets' vulnerable position, the Germans attacked with psychological advantage of knowing that their blitzkrieg tactics had already been successful in conquering vast areas of Western Europe. Given this situation, the Germans were able to secure dramatic successes in the first month of the war. In the north, Leningrad was surrounded and besieged. In the south, Kiev was captured, and by mid-October, the German army was within 80 kilometers of Moscow. The Soviets had lost some 3 million men in casualties and as prisoners of war, yet the Germans failed to take Leningrad and Moscow. They were held back by the heavy rains of October, which turned the roads to mud, and then the severe Russian winter, in which temperatures in some places fell as low as minus 38 degrees. The Germans, equipped only with their summer uniforms and the expectation that they would be victorious by winter, suffered terribly. Thousands experienced frostbite, and equipment froze and failed to function. For the first time, blitzkrieg had failed to achieve its objectives. The great Soviet commander, Marshal Zhukov, launched a counteroffensive, and Moscow was saved. The siege of Leningrad lasted from September 1941 to January 1944 and resulted in as many as 1.5 million dead, which is more than the total combined British and American casualties for the whole of the war. The inhabitants of Leningrad suffered from desperate food shortages and brought in supplies across the ice road over Lake Luganda. They were constantly bombarded by the Germans, but the city never fell. In June 1942, Hitler made a massive offensive towards southern Russia and the oil fields of the Caucasus region. By August, the German attack had reached the city of Stalingrad and occupied most of the city by the end of September. Yet the Russians refused to surrender and in fact launched a counteroffensive surrounding the Germans in a large pincer movement. Suffering from acute shortages of ammunition and food, and now overwhelmingly outnumbered, the Germans in Stalingrad had no choice but to surrender in early February 1943. Here was the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front. In the summer of 1943, Hitler tried to launch another major attack. However, the Germans were again defeated at the Battle of Kursk, where a German tank army 17 divisions strong was destroyed. For the rest of 1943, the German army was in retreat along nearly all the Eastern Front. By 1944, Leningrad was liberated and the Germans were pushed out of the Ukraine. In August, the Soviets reached Poland and Romania, and by January 1945, they were in East Prussia. They finally reached Berlin on May 2nd. Despite the German successes, the Soviets end up defeating the German army. The Germans made several mistakes that contributed to their defeat. The Germans were not prepared for a long campaign, and they suffered from a lack of supplies and inadequate equipment to face their first harsh Russian winter. In 1941, Hitler had taken control of the army himself, which had a disastrous impact on the conduct of the war in the Soviet Union. During their invasion, the Germans carried out brutal attacks against the civilian population, which made Russian resistance much stronger. Also, the supply lines of the German armed forces became hopelessly overstretched. And lastly, the German army faced continual losses of aircraft and tanks that could not be replaced. Armored divisions began the war with 328 tanks per division, whereas by the summer of 1943 they averaged only 73. The German army increasingly fell back on the use of horses, concentrating their air and tank power in only a few divisions. In contrast to the German situation, the Soviets underwent a program of reform and modernization. Learning from the devastating invasion of 1941 and adapting to circumstances, the Soviet army structure was reorganized to include a much greater reliance on tanks and artillery. The Air Force was also reformed. Now fighter bombers and ground attack aircraft were put together to form a concentrated air striking force, centrally coordinating using radio communications so that it could give effective support to ground troops. The installation of radios in tanks and aircraft was indeed crucial for improving overall communications. Another important army reform involved Stalin withdrawing himself from military responsibility and allowing his commanders much more freedom in how they conducted the war. Stalin also agreed to remove political influence over the army and restore the more traditional command structure, giving the troops back more confidence and pride. Another key factor in the Soviet victory was the impact of patriotism, spurred on by the atrocities committed by the Germans during their advance, which indicated what a German victory could mean, and fortified by the fact that Stalin did not abandon Moscow, but remained with its citizens to resist the German attack. The Russian population united in a way not seen since the revolution. Stalin, realizing that he could not call on the Soviets to mobilize in the name of communism, fed this patriotism by calling on them to save Mother Russia. In addition, the Russian Orthodox Church, previously persecuted by Soviet authorities, was reinstated to provide spiritual strength. The Soviet Union lost 3/4 of its supply of iron ore, coal, and steel, 1/3 of its rail network, and 40% of its electricity. in the German invasion. Yet it still managed to outproduce the Germans in guns, tanks, and aircraft between 1942 and 1943. This was partly due to the fact that the Soviets moved huge quantities of industrial equipment east of the Ural Mountains during the German invasion, 1,360 factories in 1942 alone. In addition, the centralized nature of the Soviet state enabled Soviet leadership to create a successful war economy. Top priority was given to producing armaments, and all factories as well as all labor camps, called gulags, were set to work for the war effort. As in the army, political supervision was decreased in the critical years to allow the planners and managers in industry to work more effectively, even to take initiative. The Allies also contributed to Soviet success. Weapons from the UK and the USA only made up 4% of the amount used by the Soviets, but there were other supplies in the form of food, raw materials, and equipment that were crucial to the Soviet war effort. The Soviets also benefited from the land lease agreements similar to those negotiated with Britain and the USA. One of the most significant conclusions of Operation Barbarossa was the defeat of Germany at Stalingrad. Psychologically, it was immensely significant. It showed for the first time that Hitler's army was fallible. It showed that Stalin's Red Army was not the shambled giant with feet of clay that many experts had predicted. It sent shivers through Berlin and gladdened the hearts of all of Hitler's enemies. One cannot exaggerate its impact on the minds of Britons and Americans who at the time had no single soldier fighting on European soil.